It is July 17th, 2025, and just a few days after Trump issued this massive ultimatum that Russia better agree to some sort of a deal to end the war in Ukraine in 50 days or else, well, Russia seems to be saying, okay, and they are proceeding on with business as usual, exactly as they would whether those threats were there or not. So, what does that mean for where this conflict is headed? What could Trump do since Russia clearly is not bowing to his demands? And is there a way in which he may try to distract from all that the US is losing in Ukraine, to distract from the complete failure that has been this attempt to wage a proxy war against Russia, and for the US to triumph over one of the largest pillars of the multipolar world? Well, we got into all of the latest and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Always good to have you. Now, let's get into the latest here, as Trump has apparently given Putin a 50-day ultimatum to agree to a deal aimed at ending the war in Ukraine, while continuing to ignore all of the points that Russia has raised as to why that would not be possible. And Trump is being criticized by politicians in Washington who claim that Russia is just going to use the 50 days to take more territory or even to potentially, quote unquote, win the war. So, how do you see this current situation, as the Russian government doesn't exactly seem to be shaking in their boots at the threats that Trump is issuing?
Yeah, of course, Russia's going to use the next 50 days to advance on the battlefield. I mean, they haven't agreed to anything. They've never said they're not going to. Trump seems he recently he's very frustrated, right? He commented recently that he always has a very nice conversation with Putin, but then he gets off the phone with him, and Russia is still bombing. And I mean, why did you think they wouldn't be? I mean, Russia has been pretty clear since before Trump was elected. Their position has not changed. In fact, it's probably gotten a little harder, right? They haven't granted Trump any concessions. They've said they're not going to grant him any concessions. They've made clear what their goals are. Putin has been as consistent as a world leader can possibly be. Trump seems to have convinced himself that he could, with his magnificent art of the deal skills, get Putin to change his position. And now he's mystified why Putin hasn't made concessions to him. He says, a deal should have been struck months ago. Right? Why? Because you haven't agreed to Russia's terms, right? Russia's made clear what their terms are, and they're winning. You're losing. I mean, that's the score. You don't get to dictate terms when you're losing. But Trump evidently seems to think he gets to do that. But my reading is that there is no coherent strategy or policy towards either Russia or the conflict in Ukraine in the Trump administration. In fact, it's very likely that there are different warring factions whispering different things in his ears at different times. And Trump quite obviously doesn't know what to do, particularly because this is Russia, right? This is not a third world country that he can threaten and bluster and do his mafia style art of the deal. You either do what I say or I break your legs and burn down your cousin's house. Capiche? Right? It doesn't work with Russia. But Trump evidently thinks it does, because he's fallen back into the Biden era policy, something he said that he wouldn't do, the failed policy of more sanctions and more weapons for the Kiev regime. Except that when Trump makes this ultimatum and makes these threats, when he's reaching back in his quiver to pull the arrow out, there's no arrows left because the Biden administration has used them all, right? When it comes to sanctions, Russia has endured 30,000 plus sanctions from the West in the last decade. There's nothing left to sanction, right? You could sanction uranium, which is the only business that Russia and the US do, and the US needs that uranium. So I mean that's not going to happen. But that's it. And Russia could always find another buyer for uranium, right? It's a finite commodity, a valuable commodity. And where does that leave Trump? His sanctions are actually another tariff war, a new tariff war on the world to try to force the rest of the world outside the West to stop trading with Russia. You either stop trading energy with Russia or we'll put 100% tariffs on everything you buy from the US, right? You're on our side or we'll destroy your economy. I mean, that's literally what he's telling the rest of the world at this point. And he's telling this, I mean, if you would take a look, and let's just take a look at the biggest buyers of Russian energy, China. The US just lost a trade war with China, right? The Trump administration raised tariffs. China raised counter tariffs, but they also cut off sales to the US of rare earth minerals that the US high-tech industry and the Pentagon desperately needs because China has a near monopoly on rare earths and that quantity and quality that they need for high-tech devices. So the Trump administration had to very quietly completely walk back from their tariff war with China and then just kind of declare we won. Like Trump does with everything, right? Like he did with the Houthis, like he does with everything. Iran. So what is he going to do? He's going to reopen that same trade war with China, and China's just going to cut off the spigot of the rare earths again. And the U.S. has no room for maneuver. India, India is the second biggest buyer of Russian energy, and the U.S. has been trying to court India geopolitically for decades to try to get them to be for China what Ukraine is for Russia, i.e., proxies to contain and confront. And are they going to ruin all of that? India with its studied, decades-long, careful foreign policy position of neutrality, right? Are you going to push them into the Russian and Chinese camp over this? I don't think so. And China and India have both indicated they're not going to change their trade policy under U.S. threats, right? They are sovereign, independent, great powers. They're not going to bow to Trump's demands. They can't, right? It would mean sacrificing their sovereignty and foreign policy independence. And then the other big buyers of Russian energy, Turkey, which is a U.S. NATO ally, Saudi Arabia, which has been buying up Russian energy and then reselling it on to Europe just after mixing it with a little bit of theirs and at a substantial markup. So are they going to sanction tariff their own allies even further after Saudi Arabia just showered Trump with adulation and gifts, right? Russia doesn't take these threats seriously, and they've made that perfectly clear. They don't think any of this is workable. And if the Trump administration did try to enact it, it would cause such a disruption to the global market that prices of energy around the world would skyrocket, oil and gas both likely. This would be causing more inflation in the United States, drastically skyrocketing inflation, with big increases in gasoline prices at the pump, when the Trump administration is already seriously, worried about U.S. midterm elections. So that's not a good look on the blowback front. Plus, Russia has managed to cope and get around 30,000 sanctions up till now, and they are confident that they can find just another workaround. Right? Countries want to trade with Russia. They want Russian energy. They want Russian grain. They want Russian minerals. If they have to, transfer oil at sea at night with ships with their transponders turned off, then that's what they'll do, right? If that's what they have to do with every sale. But the oil will still flow, and maybe it will flow a little bit less, but prices will be pushed up so high that it won't end up hurting Russia at all anyway. And there's a number of European countries, including Hungary and Slovakia, which still desperately need Russian energy, right? It's their primary provider. Russians don't regard this as feasible, as credible, and they think Trump is bluffing more or less. If he's not, they're confident that the consequences and workarounds will get around that. It's Medvedev, the former Russian president and prime minister. He's still the deputy chair of the Security Council. He put out a tweet talking about this. And he talked that Trump had it was kind of like almost like a haiku poem. And he said Trump made political theater ultimatums against Russia. The world shuddered with the potential consequences. Belligerent Europe was disappointed, and Russia didn't care. That's where the Russians are. It's the same thing with talk of weapons, right? The US just admitted last week, right? The Pentagon admitted that they have a drastic shortage, that their own stocks, the Pentagon's own stocks of many munitions that they need for their own defense and contingencies are down to a fraction of what they should be because Biden transferred everything to Ukraine and it's all already gone and up in smoke. Patriots, Patriot interceptors, the US's Achilles heel that the whole world knows about now, right? The US doesn't have air defense. All the US enemies or potential enemies, China, Iran, Russia, of course, know this. The Guardian reported from the Pentagon that the Pentagon only has 25%. That's 1/4 of the missiles left, the interceptor missiles for the Patriots that they believe they need for their own defense and contingency. So you automatically, I mean, they're talking about some kind of deal where the Europeans transfer their Patriots and the US will sell them Patriots at some time in an undetermined future to replace them, leaving Europe defenseless in air defense terms in the meantime. And there's still no one has come up with a magical solution for the problem that the US doesn't make enough interceptors. Raytheon only makes, they had hoped to ramp up production to 600 this year, and that's far short of what they need for the conflict in Ukraine, much less Israel too, much less the US's own nations, all the countries around the world that use Patriots. No, there's nothing there. It's blustered and empty threats. And no one is asking the question, what happened to those 8 Patriot batteries that were already transferred to Ukraine? Where are they? They're up in smoke. They largely don't exist anymore. And any more that they send, they cobble together without enough interceptors for them on top of it, are going to follow the same route, which is why there's so much hesitation. No one, you give yours. No, you give yours, right? That's what's going on right now. And they're talking, again, all of these other munitions, the 155 millimeter artillery shells, guided mobile launcher rocket systems. The Europeans don't make. So Trump announced that NATO was going to, he's not going to give any weapons to the Kiev regime. NATO was going to buy all the weapons from Trump, from the US. Weapons that don't exist, but let's jump past that little inconvenient fact for the moment. He's promising the American taxpayers, you're not going to pay for this, the Europeans are. Well, not technically the Europeans, it's actually going to be NATO. So NATO is going to buy them, and it's going to be great. We're just doing business. Rachel, Which country is the biggest single contributor to the NATO budget again?
I think that would be the US, and I don't know that there are any that are too close to
I
it.
thought it was the US too. Wait a minute, doesn't that mean that the US taxpayers are still going to be paying for these weapons?
Mhm.
Now there might be some of the MAGA holdouts a little slower on the uptake that might not get this sleight of hand, but we're here to break the bad news to you. You'll still be paying for it if they manage to cobble together any weapons. The Europeans are already freaking out about this deal. They're like, actually, we don't have the money. France already said, well, we're not buying from the Americans. We've got to buy from our military industrial complex, which doesn't make anything. So we'll leave that one to the side. Hungary and Slovakia said no, they're just against giving any weapons to the Kiev regime, but they'll give some humanitarian aid. Italy said, we don't have the money for this. We're not playing along. The Czech Republic, one of the more hawkish pro-Kiev regime states, says, well, we're already trying to buy artillery shells on the international mercenary market. So, yeah, we're not playing with that game either. And right now, the only ones who, Europeans who are willing to buy into Trump's dictate that they're going to buy is Germany, the UK, and a couple of Scandinavian states. That's it. So Europe is already, you know, tossing the reins here. They're not obeying their commands. And on on top of all of this, there was an attempt, as David Ignatius claimed in the Washington Post, there was talk within the Trump administration. Exactly what I said the neocons would be whispering in his ear since he was elected. David Ignatius used the words in his headline this week. You need to escalate to de-escalate, right? That is, they're trying to push Trump back into the war. And they went through all the potential missile systems that they could send to the Kiev regime to hit back against Russia, to try to force Russia to the negotiation table on U.S. terms, right? They talked about the ATACMS, which they've already tried and didn't work, and they've already wasted 500 of them, and to no operational effect because Russian air defense and electronic warfare quickly adapted to them. They could send the JASSMs, but the JASSMs are air launched. They have to be fired from the F-16s, which means they'd have to come out of hiding in West Ukraine and expose themselves to a much more modern and powerful Russian Air Force with much longer range radar and air-to-air missiles like the R-37M and the Russian S-400 air defense, which means those F-16s would be wiped out like that. So JASSMs aren't a good deal either. And then we're told by David Ignatius that Trump asked about the Tomahawk. We don't know if he actually did or if someone within the administration is trying to push this, but the Tomahawk was ruled out as well because while it certainly has the range, right, it's actually for the last few decades been an air and sea launched cruise missile, right, to so that it could comply with the Short and Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which the U.S. has pulled out of, but they still don't have any substantial ground-based launchers for it. So according to the terms of the INF Treaty, you were allowed to have this range of missiles, but they had to be fired from sea and air carriers, which means a Navy, which is where the U.S. usually fires their Tomahawks from. Oh, but the Kiev regime has no Navy. Because in 2014, according to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, 75% of the Ukrainian Navy defected to Russia and took all their ships with them. So they've got no Navy. They've got no strategic bombers to launch them either. So they've got nothing to fire them. And on top of that, the Tomahawk is also a strategic weapon. It can carry a nuclear warhead, right? Russia doesn't know whether any given missile hurtling into Russia towards Moscow or St. Petersburg, if it's a Tomahawk, is carrying a nuclear or a conventional warhead, which means that they have to regard any Tomahawk heading towards one of their cities as a nuclear first strike and take the appropriate response. They can't play games with that. They have to do that, which means they have to fire one of their own, which already is a potential nuclear exchange, even if the US is not. So there are some sane people, maybe in the Pentagon, somewhere within the Trump administration, that said, oh, so the Tomahawk is not an option either, right? For all of these reasons. So that leaves them with no long range threat to force Russia to the table, no meaningful weapons supply, right? There's no financing worked out with the Europeans, and they don't have the options anyway. And this tariffs threats against the rest of the world, Russia regards as unworkable and a damp squib. Where does that leave Trump? It leaves Trump in a desperate position, bluffing, and having kicked the can down the road 50 days. But what does he do? What excuse does he come to in the next 50 days? Because he's got two options. Either he just backs away from these ultimatums. I don't know, maybe he does something with the Epstein file, something to create some kind of media storm, backs out. But people within his own administration, Lindsey Graham and the others in the Senate and the Congress, the Western media, which has been a whip driver of this conflict from the very beginning, the European elite will all be on him like ticks on a dog, right? For surrendering to Putin, for not following through with what he promised. If he does do it and it doesn't work, then he's just weak and the Russians just rolled over him. That is not a good position for Donald Trump. He desperately needs flack. He needs something to distract the American people, the American political system in the world in the next 50 days so that he doesn't have to make that bad decision where there are no good options for him.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. And I'm surprised he just straight up doubled down and was like, yeah, we're going to have a 50-day ultimatum. Because exactly as you're noting there, the US doesn't have any quote unquote good options in terms of if Trump was really looking to end this war. I don't think that any of them in the US really are looking for that. But as you have all of this talk, all of this back and forth happening, you also have what Russia is actively doing and will still be doing for these next 50 days. I know that we've seen nightly barrages involving hundreds of drones and missiles targeting Ukraine. We've seen Kiev attempting to send a number of drones into Russia of its own. So when it comes to what we talked about before, which is this drone war of attrition, how do you see it right now, and how is it playing a role in the overall conflict as you still have the ongoing situation on the battlefield?
Yeah, it's really more or less completely one-sided, right? Because we talked about this. The Kiev regime has no air defense left, right? They may claim ridiculous numbers, but the videos on the ground in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities show Garan after Garan after missile after Garan impacting. So Russia has complete drone and missile dominance of Ukrainian airspace at this point. There's no effective air defense, not even in the Ukrainian capital at this point. So they can fire off 100 or 200 drones a night, but Russia has the best air defense and electronic warfare system in the world. And the Kiev regime's own, shall we say, much smaller warhead drones, right? Very, very few of them are ever getting through. And I got to be honest, I'm sitting in Moscow, and the only way we know that there has been any drone strikes or any drone war going on is if we read about drones being shot down the next day, because we don't experience what they're experiencing in Kiev on a nightly basis. We don't even know about it because most of them are shot down. I mean, if not all of them, then nearly all of them. So Russia, meanwhile, has ramped up their production of the Garan, the geranium, right? With the evolution of the Shahed 136, these long-range strike drones. They're now producing about 500 of them a day. And the Kiev regime itself Zelensky tells us that Russia will be producing 1,000 of them a day by the end of the year. 1,000, which means they've got 1,000 to use every day. Russia has so many of these long range strike drones already that they're having to find other uses for them. They're no longer using them just for strategic long range strikes. They're using them operationally in the rear of the contact line against the Kiev regime's logistics, but also increasingly even on the front line itself, just as an added strike weapon, simply because they're making more of them than they can effectively use. And yet hundreds of them are on a nightly basis, hunting down Western weapons, hunting down these underground drone workshops, everything that the Kiev regime has. And they're increasingly effective at it because there is no air defense left to intercept most of them. So this long range strike of attrition, this is why the Trump administration is panicking. That's why they're scrambling to try to bring to get some type of air defense out of the West to Kiev. That's why they're desperately looking for some type of missile option to give a counterstrike that could be effective to the Kiev regime, and they're coming up with nothing either. So while Russia is advancing daily on the battlefield, and this is the point that no one can deny, Pokrovsk itself right now is in an operational encirclement with no supply line to that important logistical city in the Donbass that is not covered by Russian artillery and drones, both of them at this point. And they're facing physical encirclement in the coming weeks, in the next couple of weeks, on the battlefield and in the skies, and obviously diplomatically. It's not looking good for Zelensky in Kiev. Maybe that's part of why he's doing some kind of frantic government reshuffle, moving his prime minister there, moving his defense minister to the U.S. And but it's all like shuffling deck chairs around the Titanic, except that Ukraine isn't big enough. Titanic, so, but that's where it is.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see too. I know, kind of going back to what you were saying before about how Trump is in this position. He's issued this 50-day ultimatum, but things are going to start crumbling in Kiev and in Ukraine overall. So now Trump is trying to figure out, okay, how do we move forward here? And kind of as you were noting too, I know that a lot of this talk about, oh, long range weapons, there's only so much the US can do. I mean, it could try to escalate, it would not be smart. But when it comes to this push to, oh, well, Europe's going to take more responsibility for it, right? They're going to quote unquote buy the weapons, surely, that exist. That kind of goes back to what Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was talking about back in February, where he was kind of telling Europe, hey, we need you guys to take on more of the responsibility for what is the proxy war against Russia, because there's other things that we want to focus on. So when it comes
like
to that
war with China.
Exactly. And now you see, as NATO is kind of bringing in, oh, we also, NATO Chief Mark Rutte is bringing in China into the conversation of, oh, we really need to watch out for them, and also Russia. Does it seem like they're setting up for a much bigger war? Does it seem like the US kind of wants to, not focus on Ukraine as much because things aren't good there, so that they can try to focus on Iran, China, whatever else that may be? How do you see kind of that chessboard, as it's very clear that the US is not only not going to be able to beat Russia, but they are going to be eventually humiliated by Russia as we keep going in this direction?
Dmitry Trenin is one of the top Russian international relations scholars. He's at the Russian International Affairs Council. He's a professor at the Higher School of Economics. He wrote a piece in the Russian media this week that was reprinted in RT, where he says we're already in World War III, that we are in a world-spanning global order reshaping conflict right now, right? That Russia, Iran, and China are all being targeted by the US. And this is all part of the same larger conflict at this point. And it's really pretty hard to disagree with that logic. And certainly Russia and China have long been cooperating, I think, as if that is the case. And it looks like Iran is starting, having survived a very recent regime change attempt by Israel and the U.S. To move in the same direction. But I mean, the Biden administration thought they could move on Russia quick, take out Russia quick, ignore the Middle East, i.e., ignore Iran, and pivot to China. Didn't work out so well for them. So the Trump administration said, well, that's not working. Maybe we can palm Russia, dealing with Russia, off on the Europeans, take out Iran real quick, and pivot to China. That's not working out really well for them either. And then this week, we had the word that the U.S. is now pressuring Japan and Australia to commit what they would do if a war just happened to break out with China over Taiwan. They're going to be the proxies in the front lines, right? Right? That was the U.S. pressure on Japan and Australia. So obviously there are at least some people like Elbridge Colby at the Pentagon in the Trump administration that are already just skipping past the failures to regime change Russia and Iran and are just moving on to suicide against China. Because ultimately, the U.S. is facing critical, you want to call it imperial or hegemonic overstretch, overreach at this point. They can't deal with any one of these three opponents, and that they're still trying to take on all three of them at the same time. Kellogg, the Trump administration's envoy to babysit Kiev, he admitted this about a month ago in an interview with Western media, and he said that the U.S. used to be able to deal with Russia and China and Iran and North Korea separately. And they can't do that anymore because they're all cooperating with each other, because the U.S. has pushed them all to that position where they are now all cooperating together, and that the U.S. can't take them all on anymore. And so it needs to have a more realist foreign policy, and also the burden sharing, the division of labor that you're talking about, right? The idea to palm the conflict against Russia off on the Europeans, to palm the conflict with Iran off on the Israelis. The problem is neither the Europeans nor the Israelis are up to the task of taking on their respective division of labor, and the U.S. has been forced to go back into both of those affairs and still can't settle them. It's an unworkable position. The U.S. needs a foreign policy of backing away from confrontation with Russia, China, and Iran, and finding a more constructive, non-conflictory stance, but that you just can't give up hegemony. It's like a power like that is a drug, right? It's simply politically unacceptable in Washington, in Brussels and Berlin, or anywhere where they're still all addicted to this hegemonic unipolar moment and have not come to grips with the changing realities of their economic and military and even political power in the world, how it has declined, and how the respective power of China, Russia, a resurgent Russia, the global South has risen. And until there's probably some major military and/or economic defeat, I don't think that type of political dawning, that type of realization and changing of the political guard is possible in the U.S. or Europe at this moment. So it's kind of like that Keanu Reeves speed when you're on a bus that can't slow down, hurtling towards doom. That's where the U.S. is, more or less. Trump had an opportunity to walk away from the conflict in Ukraine. It was unlikely. But he's proven that he didn't do it. He couldn't do it. He didn't have the personal will. He didn't have the political capital to just walk away. The pressure from the deep state, from Congress, from the media, he just walked right back into it and is now just following Biden's footsteps down to that inevitable end.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch it, but at the same time, exactly as you were noting, they didn't learn when they tried to go take out Russia, and it wasn't as easy as they thought it would be, and then they just keep going, and it's like, well, they're, you know, digging their grave at this point, although it won't happen overnight. It is, the wheels are still in motion, and the US just keeps going in the same direction. Certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. International relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda, thanks so much for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/RachelBlevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.